And I want you to ask yourself, as you're looking at this, what percentage of my total revenue makes up my profit, right? Is my profit percentage the same, right? If my profit is set to be 15%, 5%, is that staying the same throughout from month to month, year to year? Today, what I want to do is I want to talk about the importance of keeping pulse on your business. Yes, keeping pulse on your business. Just like you keep your pulse on your wrist, I want you to keep your pulse on your business. I think a lot of us, we buy these like iWatches, Fitbits, and I think they got this new one now called an Oura Ring. And we spend so much money like monitoring our health. We also need to keep pulse on our business too. And especially right now, because right now is a very, very volatile time, right? There are a lot of macroeconomic things that are happening in the world. There's a lot of microeconomic things that are happening. And all of these things can impact the outcome of your business. And I think as human beings, and as business owners, it's really easy, right? It's easy to get busy with this thing called life and business, right? There's things that we need to do. There's things that we need to check off. There's things that have to get done, emergencies that happen, and life that happens, right? And it's easy to get caught up in this life and business. But as John Lennon says, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And I don't want you guys to become a victim of life just happening. And while it can be mentally fulfilling, right, getting things done, I can tell you, like, I was like hitting that check mark on my to-do list, and it was like binging me every time. And I was like, oh, this feels so good. I just want to keep binging checklist items, right? And it's so gratifying to check those things off on your checklist. But the reality is, when we're uber focused, right? We're uber focused on our businesses. We're uber focused on fulfillment and just getting things done, making sure things got off that checklist, that orders got out the door, right? And when we're just focusing on getting done, right, what happens is we fail to optimize and really monitor our real needs, right? Our real needs in our business, those administrative needs, things that really can, if we monitor those things, if we tweak them in time, really could have a significant impact on our profitability. And when we do get that chance to look up after we've been super busy, I know if you guys have ever been, I'm sure you guys have been super busy one time or another, right? And you've looked up, right? What do we find? We find that life just happened, right? Life just happening. And suddenly what happens is when we're focusing on other things, what happens is we start to experience results that we didn't plan for. And our business goes into autoplay and life just happens, right? And you guys know, right? You guys know that recently a lot of things have happened in our economy, right? I took my annual trip to New York City. And it's a great thing to like have an annual trip that you do, because it really gives you a sense of what changes have happened since the last time you were there. And when I'm in New York City, one of the things that I do is I ride a lot of Ubers, right? I'm like riding Ubers, going back and forth between New Jersey and New York. And what I noticed was that those Uber costs were 30% higher than what they were a year before. I don't know if you guys gone to New York or not, but 30% higher just for taking an Uber than what it was a year. And again, that's the benefit of taking that annual trip, that you can see that. And you can especially start to capture those price changes that happen. And you guys have all experienced that trip to the grocery store, right? And I think all of us have gotten price shock or sticker shock when we've gone to the grocery store. I think what we used to spend $100 for, now we spend like $130 or $150, right? And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Economics, right, the annual inflation rate is about 3.7%. So 3.7% is what the U.S. Bureau of Labor tells us. But however, depending on the industry that you're in, right, depending on the industry that you're in and exactly what you're consuming, this inflation rate can actually be a whole lot more than 3.7%, right? Look at fuel costs. And so my question is, what are you doing right now to really measure the rate of inflation? And how are you determining how inflation is actually impacting your business? How are you determining how inflation is impacting your business today? How are you measuring this rate of inflation? And to get into the details of exactly how it's impacting you, what are you doing today to ensure that your profits, right, your business profits as well as your owner's pay, right, how are you making sure that those percentages are staying in line with your total revenue? Meaning that your owner's pay as a percentage, your profit as a percentage of total revenue is staying consistent. What are you doing to measure that in your business? And, how often are you measuring this? What is your process for measuring this to making sure that your profits, your owner's pay are keeping up with the rate of inflation? How are you monitoring that consistently? And so what I want to do is I want to start our conversation on how do you monitor inflation? How do you monitor its impact on your business? And how do you detect when inflation is happening to you, right? I think inflation is one of those things that it doesn't happen for you, it actually happens to you, right? And so first of all, it starts with having a consistent process, right? A consistent process to monitor your financial health, right? And I'm going to stress that word consistent. Consistent is the key word here, right? It's not an annual event that you're doing with your accountant and looking at how your financial statements are done, right? It's not even a quarterly event, right? You should be monitoring your financial statements at least monthly, okay? So at least monthly for you guys that are bigger businesses out there, I would say making sure your books are up to date at least weekly. So at least monthly. And not only do you want to monitor your financial statements, but you want to actually monitor them based upon something called common size percentages. So, and what I mean by common size percentages, I'm looking at what is the percentage of each line item against my total revenue. If I'm looking at my income statement, if I'm looking at my balance sheet, what percentage of my balance sheet items as compared to total assets, right? And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for expense creep, right? I'm looking for what line items are getting bigger, especially when it comes to cost of goods sold or materials and subs. Are those percentages going up as in relation to my total revenue over time, right? And I'm looking at my balance sheet. Is my cash going down? Is it costing me more cash as I move on? Because what I'm looking for is I'm looking for that creep. I'm looking for that inflation creep. And particularly, I'm looking for, I think one of the best indicators that you can look at is your cost of goods sold or your mats and subs for those of us that are doing profit first, right? That mats and sub percentage in terms of total revenue. And I want you to ask yourself as you're looking at this, what percentage of my total revenue makes up my profit, right? Is my profit percentage the same, right? If my profit is set to be 15%, 5%, is that staying the same throughout from month to month, year to year? Is what I'm looking for. And then what I'm doing is I'm looking at how is my percentages, right? My percentage of mats and subs, my percentage of cost of goods sold, my percentage of profit. How does that look from a year ago? When I look at my statements today and I look at 12 months ago, how are my percentages changing? Are they more? Are they less? Are they the same? That's what I'm looking for. And if my percentages are less, so if my mats and subs is a smaller percentage of my total revenue, right? What does this mean? Does this mean that I got more efficient with my purchasing, right? Did I intentionally shop my vendors to make sure I was getting the best price on those? Did I implement some type of request for proposal? I actually took multiple bids to make sure I was getting the best deal. Did you do something intentionally that drove down your cost of goods sold or your mats? Like, did you do an overall price increase because maybe you started a profit first program and you weren't quite there, so you did that? And so maybe we should be expecting a lower percentage of cost of goods sold in mats and subs, right? And if you did do something very intentional, right? If you did something intentional to decrease your mats and subs or cost of goods sold as a percentage of revenue, right? I want you to capture what that process was. I want you to capture that process and I want you to repeat that process, right? Because we want to repeat the things that worked, right? We want to create that reduced cost outcome, right? And we want to learn from our past and really let those become part of our best practices. Now, on the other hand, if your mats and subs or cost of goods sold, right, I'm using those kind of interchangeably, those two terms, if they've increased, right, if that percentage has increased as in relation to my total revenue. So let's say I was originally at 30% mats and sub, and now I'm at 45% mats and sub, or now I want you to ask yourself a different question. I want you to ask yourself what happened here, right? Does this mean that your vendors have increased, right? Does that mean that my vendor prices have gone up, right? Is this because there's inflation that's happening? Are there macroeconomic factors that's happening in the environment right now? And if it is inflation, do I need to increase my price, right? Do I need to increase my price because of these macroeconomic factors? Because if you don't, what's going to happen is your quality of life will start to diminish, right? Because if you've got less margins, right, that means you have less real revenue. That means that it's going to be harder to pay those rent costs. It's going to be harder to pay those salaries, right? If you're not keeping up with inflation, right? And then if it's not inflation, let's say you've been, it's not inflation for whatever reason, you're one of those lucky people that weren't affected by inflation. Is it time to reevaluate your vendors, right? Are your vendors maybe having something like price increase or going up that's happening? And maybe it's time to take that step back and do some competitive bidding with multiple vendors, right? And when you evaluate your market, when you step back and you go, when I'm looking at my market, and I'm looking at my industry and I'm looking at my competitors that are out there, right? How are my competitors also responding to the current economic times, right? What are people doing in my industry that have similar businesses to me? How are they responding? And sometimes it's good to go ahead and say, hey, let me just ask around. Let me do some secret shopping here, right? Are you seeing an overall increase in your industry right now, right? It's everybody's prices going up, and maybe you need to get on that bandwagon and catch up with that. Are you seeing more customers signing? I've had clients that suddenly had a big boom in revenue. They had a big boom of clients that are signing. If your revenue is rapidly growing, right? If your revenue is growing, my question becomes, are your customers seeing you as the best bargain in town, right? Are they seeing you as a deal that's too good to pass up? And by the way, none of you guys should be positioning yourself as the best bargain in town. Okay. Don't let me hear that one of you guys have been positioning yourself as the best bargain in town. I don't want any best bargains in town. I want best quality in town, right? Best value, but no best bargains. Okay. Now you figure out how to adjust your prices. What is your process for adjusting those prices, right? Are you doing an annual price increase, or are you going to just do this for new customers only? Maybe you're grandfathering your current clients at their price, but for new clients, you're bringing them in at a higher rate. And then the next question is, how do you communicate a price increase to your customers? Too many times, I meet with entrepreneurs and they tell me, they said, Susanne, I feel really uncomfortable asking for a price increase. I just don't feel comfortable doing that. I think my customers are going to balk. I think that people are going to tell us no. They're going to say that we're way over the industry. And when I listen to their tone of voices, I kind of get a feeling that they're almost ashamed for the need of adjusting their prices. But first of all, inflation is not your fault. Inflation happens. Okay. It happens to you, right? Not for you. And what happens is, if you fail to keep up with inflation, if you fail to keep up when your costs are rising, right? Which they are rising right now, what happens is that's going to rob you from your future, right? If your vendors are increasing their price, that means that your cost is rising. If your vendors are increasing their price, that means your cost of production, right? Your cost to bring your goods and services to the marketing is also going up. That means that if you don't adjust your price, your margins are going to be squeezed, right? Meaning that if you're not willing to raise your prices, you're accepting lower margins. And what that means is that ultimately, you're going to have less money to pay your A players, right? You're going to have less money available to pay for your rent. And at the end of the day, less money to pay yourself, right? As well as your profit, right? And so ultimately what's happening is, if you choose not to raise your price, you're making a decision to finance your client's endeavor is what's happening. And it's at the expense of your future viability. And I don't want any of us to be that person that grants that customer that great price and then has to turn around and struggle to meet that demand, right? That's not winning. And we've all been there before, where, there's not enough margins to be able to hire the right person to get the job done because it's just too expensive to hire that A player, right? Especially right now where A players can really shop where they want to go, right? We want to be a competitive market that really attracts A players, which does mean the right benefits as well as the right salary too. And then when you don't have the margins, right, now you're constantly shopping for lower cost alternatives, right? You can't take the average anymore. You have to find someone that's willing to go below average. And that means that you're going to have to look at options that may be a lower quality of production too. And because, there's only so low that you can go, right? There's only so low that you can go on your price. That means you have to look for potentially less quality in order to meet your demand. And it's sad because I've seen too many business owners. What happens is they end up in debt, right? They end up in debt because they have to borrow to make ends meet because they simply won't raise their price. And these entrepreneurs are so fixated on revenue. They're so fixated on, yes, I want to get that sale, that they forget to look at what's most important. That most important thing is the bottom line at the end of the day. And so I want to think about, who really wins here? Who really wins here when you don't raise your prices, right? Who really wins here? Because at the end of the day, if you don't raise your prices, you're forced to give work that you're not proud of, right? You can't afford to hire your best and brightest on your team. And personally, I don't think anybody wins in that situation, right? I would rather have an environment where everybody wins, because when everybody wins, that means your customer is happy. And that means that you're also available to service them again, right? And that's the real meaning of winning. It's that everybody wins, a happy customer, a great experience, and you get to serve them again, right? So adjust those prices. So please, if you guys are, any of you guys are in that situation where, you're starting to see that price increase, you're starting to see that those margins being squeezed, especially when you compare your gross margins from last year to 12 months ago, your cost of goods sold or mats and subs as a percentage of revenue from a year ago, please do not delay in putting that off, okay? Because reality is you're going to have that conversation, whether it's sooner or later, you're going to have that conversation. And the sooner you do it, the better you're going to be able to course correct and not end up, in those desperate situations, right? Where really it's too late to do it, right? Because now it's such a struggle to pay bills. You're maxed out on those line of credits. It's really best to do that now when you're starting to notice that. And again, monitor those statements every single month. Make sure that you are keeping up with that inflation, because it is creeping in with that. And do not experience opportunity costs, right? So make sure that you're pricing in accordingly.